We don't know how sincere all parties are because there are rocks and challenges along the way, the big one being Cyprus, of course. A lot of the European countries hide behind Cyprus. They hide behind countries like France because they don't want to deal with the very tricky issues. And in my mind, if I'm a big country like Turkey, I mean, Turkey will be the largest country in Europe very soon after it surpasses Germany, both in terms of demographically and hopefully at some point in the future economically. If Turkey really wants to show, in my mind, its sincerity, it has to take the first step. I mean, I understand if I was Turkish, I'd be frustrated as well. But I think that the European Union is good for Turkey, not just because of what the Europeans offer to Turkey, but because of what it offers the Turks to themselves. You know, the Prime Minister said many times the Copenhagen criteria is the Ankara criteria. Sometimes I question that when I look at the behavior, when I look at the way in which the Prime Minister responds to criticism, etc. But if he is sincere, I think it's a great way to move forward. And even if the EU offers membership to Turkey, then Turkey has a choice. It can be like Norway or maybe Switzerland to say, thank you, we fulfilled all the criteria that you ask of us. We are not only a modern society, but we also are a transatlantic Western society. We don't need to be part of the European. Thanks, but no thanks.
Mm-hmm. And that's a strong alternative, you think?
I think it is actually. Let me give you a good example. When I look at the new EU ministry that was created recently by the minister Egemen Bayish, you know, they're focusing on how to have better Turkish-EU relations. But the symbol for this is very telling, right? There's the stars of the they're the stars of the European Union that are there, meshed with the kind of crescent and the star. In many ways, it's almost like Pac-Man, right? This crescent is eating the European stars. So in many ways, I think that shows a sense of self-confidence. I mean, if I was Turkish and I've been spending so much time trying to convince the Europeans, now it's time for the Europeans to convince Turkey that maybe we need you. Because as an American, as someone who sees the world from a much broader perspective, if Europe wants to be a global player, it has no choice but to include Turkey. And at this point, I think Europeans have done enough to discourage Turkey. Now it's time to encourage Turkey. I mean, if Turkey really is going to join the EU, then I think the Europeans have to do something on their part. I mean, in some ways, I like to use the analogy of kind of, if there's a girl I really like, and I keep on asking her, she says, no, I don't want to go out with you, I don't want to date. Then one day I stop caring about her, suddenly she becomes very interested in me. Does that mean that I change my feelings? Maybe, maybe not. This is for the Turkish people to decide. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. And from an American perspective, I don't think it matters either way. I just think it matters that the reforms that are being pushed and the reforms that are necessary for the EU are also necessary for Turkey domestically.
Joshua, what do you think about the tension between Israel and Turkey, especially after this Mavi Marmara incident?
I mean, it's been a very difficult period, not just for Turkey, but for Israel, and also for U.S.-Turkish relations as well. I mean, Israel is a very critical ally in the Middle East, and Israel is very scared right now. You know, what happened in Egypt could completely change their strategic environment. What's happening in Syria completely changes it. But these developments began much before, like you mentioned. You know, it began with the Gaza operation, you know, back when Turkey was right in the middle of negotiating Syria and Israel. And the fact that that happened at the same time that, that Prime Minister Omar was sitting in the house of Prime Minister Erdogan and he was on the phone with President Assad, I think the Prime Minister felt a real personal grudge about this. And the idea, I can understand very clearly why Turkey and why the Turkish people would respond the way they did, because Israel seems to be operating in a way that seems to be outside of international rules. I mean, the United States does this often, but it's one thing to have a global power that works with its allies to change and shape international order, but to have a state like Israel in Turkey's own environment that's supposedly a close ally doing something so contrary to Turkish interests, and to attack a international humanitarian ship and to kill 9 citizens, including 1 American citizen, I think was one step too far. And I think it's taken a long time to get where we are today. And I think that the passions and the tensions and the emotions have subsided now, and that hopefully something will be worked out. But of course, every time I see the Prime Minister speak about Israel and speak about Gaza, speak about the Palestinian issue, it's so clear to me that this is an emotional issue. This is an issue that goes directly to his heart. And as a leader, the reason the Prime Minister is so successful as a leader, as a global leader actually in the region, is partly because of the fact that he has such strong emotional reactions to this. And so the idea of kind of bygones be bygones doesn't seem possible. There has to be an apology. There has to be some acknowledgement that what was done was bad. You know, that Israel has to say, look, this was something that we regret what happened. But at the same time, there has to be some diplomatic solution here, some clever way of finding a way for the Israelis and the Turks to get back to business as usual. Because I think these countries still do need each other. Business interests are very strong. tourism is a very important part of this. And Israel and Turkey are the two major democracies in the region. They're the only indigenous democracies. And so if these two countries are going to weather the storm here in the Middle East and to see the transformation of Egypt, see the transformation of Saudi Arabia, see the transformation of Syria, then they have to work together. So I hope that that will be possible. But right now I think we first have to overcome the emotional side of things. And I think this is where the U.S. can be very important. I think the U.S. can help moderate this because we are close allies with both Israel and Turkey, and being able to step in. And up until this point, I don't think that the U.S. has done as much as maybe we could. I think behind the scenes we're doing a lot, but perhaps we could do more to encourage. And I think here, it's not just about governments. It's about civil society. It's about, university exchange programs. It's about business societies really pushing their governments. In democracies, the only way to get change is to have civil society push their governments and push the parties. And until that happens, there might be less incentive for the Prime Minister to soften his tone on Israel and less incentive for the Israelis to soften their tone with Turkey.
Another fault line in Turkish-American relations seems to be Turkey's relation with Iran and Turkey's attitude towards Iranian nuclear energy program.
Yeah.
What would you say about that?
I mean, the first thing to say here is, Turkey and Iran have never been the closest of friends, historically speaking, right? The Persian Empire and the Ottomans were always kind of at each other, and they always had different perspectives, and there was no love lost between these two. But at the same time, they have the longest border that's been peaceful, right? So here you have two partners that have not necessarily liked each other, but they learned to live with each other. And I think it's important from an American perspective to understand this history, because if you don't understand this history, a lot of what Turkey has done in the last couple of years would be seen from very alarmist views. What's happening? There's a new Islamic axis being formed, Sunni, Turkey and Shia Iran coming together to create this new Middle Eastern order that's based on Islam. I don't think that's necessarily what's happening. I think what's happening is much more of kind of pragmatic understanding in Turkey that we have to have good relations with all of our neighbors, including Iran. The problem is the cost that this has. Because of the behavior of the Iranians, and particularly Ahmadinejad and his rhetoric. I mean, the rhetoric he has is just too far, calling for the destruction of the state of Israel, the types of things he's doing. Now, Ahmadinejad has his own trouble at home right now. And the question is, when Turkey is trying to be a mediator between the West and Iran, does Iran have any incentive? I mean, one of the difficulties is, it seems to me that Turkey is playing a very difficult game of chess with the Iranians. Unfortunately, the Iranians invented the game of chess. And so if I'm Turkish and I'm talking to my Turkish counterparts, I would warn you to be very careful with the Iranians. They'll say one thing to you and they'll say something else. Iran ultimately wants a solution, wants to find some way to establish itself as a global power. The only way to do that is not through Turkey, but it's through the West. And so if Turkey wants to be a mediator, the problem is, just like Turkey is a bridge, people step on bridges. Turkey doesn't want to be a bridge. Turkey wants to be a catalyst. And I think that what we saw 1 year ago was very troubling from an American perspective. We understood that Turkey was trying to mediate with our Brazilian friends some type of solution. But to vote against the UN sanction that all of our major transatlantic partners, all the major actors had agreed upon, was too much. Why couldn't you abstain? Abstaining would give you the same message. And I think that there was a lot of missed opportunities here. And I don't just blame my Turkish counterparts. In fact, I blame the American side much more, because I think mixed signals were sent to the Turkish side. I think that America, particularly Washington, has many different organs sometimes. And sometimes the State Department, the White House, all these different groups send different signals. And so when Turkey decided to not just abstain, but to vote against, it sent a very powerful signal in Washington that might have been the wrong signal. Because I think that in many ways, the U.S. and Turkey need each other for trying to figure out how to solve this issue. Because Turkey will suffer just as much as any other country if Iran has a strong nuclear weapons program. It will force Turkey in some ways to get its own. Nuclear power is one thing. Nuclear weapons are another thing. And of course here, Israel is the big elephant in the room. Everyone knows they have a program, but no one talks about it. But saying, like the Prime Minister does, that we want to have a nuclear-free Middle East is a non-starter. Because clearly, the Israelis have weapons, they have strategic interests. They're a very small country. All it takes is one weapon from Iran to Israel, and the state of Israel is gone. Whereas from Israel to Iran, it takes many more. And so being able to help the Iranians feel self-confident enough to feel the same way Turkey does, which is, look, the Iranians aren't pointing their weapons at us. Israel's not pointing its weapons at us. The best way to move forward is through economic, pragmatic relations. Turkey can be very helpful in translating the language, because Turkey understands the language of the Iranians. And sometimes I think the West misinterprets this language. When they speak so closely, when Ahmadinejad comes to Istanbul and goes to the Blue Mosque, and we see the very friendly relations where the Prime Minister is kissing the Iranian president, it sends cold chills through our spine. It makes us feel very uncomfortable because we look at Ahmadinejad and the Iranian regime as being antithetical to what the West and liberal democracy is about. And the fact that Turkey has said nothing about the protest movements, the Green Movement in Iran the first time around, and the second one, is very troubling to us, because for us, if Turkey is going to be a democracy and is going to be a successful inspiration and a model, it also has to talk to Iran. You can't just talk to the Arab countries, you must also talk to Iran. And so I think that there are ways that we can work together, but we're still having misunderstandings on both sides. And I think partly it comes from the fact that we've not spent as much time focusing on these issues as we should. And I think in some ways, if there's any optimistic silver lining of this Arab Spring, I think it's reinforced the role that Turkey can play and the importance that we need to place, meaning the United States and the European allies need to place on working with Turkey in the Middle East, so that we can find ways of making sure that these other revisionist powers, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Iran, don't promote their versions of the Islamic Republic in different countries, or the Wahhabi version of things.
Another issue which creates some tension between Turkey and America is the Armenian genocide issue. Will Congress ever pass a resolution, or what should be done to resolve this issue?
At the risk of getting myself in a lot of trouble with your viewers and maybe with yourself, I would argue that the Congress does not matter. I mean, I'm from the state of Virginia. The state of Virginia, a couple years ago, adopted a resolution condemning us for slavery. I mean, slavery happened over 200 years ago. I'm perfectly happy apologizing for slavery. I was not a part of it. My family was a part of it. My great-great-grandparents probably had slaves, and I think it's horrible what happened. But in many ways, what President Obama said when he came to Turkey is still true today. The strength of a country does not come from being perfect. It comes from your imperfections. And understanding that your history does not necessarily all have to be negative. The fact that the Armenians and Turks lived for so many centuries in harmony with each other should be the focus. What happened in 1915 and continued until the end of World War I was a very difficult period. Whether you call it a genocide, whether you call it a tragedy, whether you call it the issue, in many ways is immaterial to the actual pragmatic interest today. The interest of the Armenian people and the Turkish people is to get along. Unfortunately, there are diaspora communities both in my country and throughout the world that have an interest in holding on with grudges. Their entire identity has been based on the fact that their grandparent was killed by some Kurdish tribe or some, heat or desert or some Turkish soldiers. And I think that the issue of who killed who, the bottom line is these people died. How they died is important, but in my mind, it happened in a very difficult period of a civil war, in the middle of a big war in which empires were collapsing. If you talk about the Armenian genocide, you have to talk about the Muslim genocide that was happening in the Balkans. So in my mind, this is an issue for scholars to discuss. This is an issue for you and I as academics to be able to sit down and have differing views and have a respectful view. It's not the place of Congress to legislate history, particularly legislate history in which America has no business being. But unfortunately, U.S. Congress does this everywhere. It's not unique to Turkey. And I think a congressional resolution means zero to Turkey. It does not mean that Armenians can claim rights. It doesn't mean that Armenians can come and take back Nemrut Dağ or pieces of Turkish land. And so I think as a result, there needs to be a stronger leadership in Turkey to explain to the Turkish people that the American Congress, this is how it works, this is how it understands. And it's also incumbent on people like myself, as Americans who are friends of Turkey, to say, look, it doesn't matter. The U.S. Congress has no role whatsoever in your future. And I think that understanding that's important. Unfortunately, every year in April, the U.S.-Turkish relationship is held hostage by this issue. And it causes such bad feelings and such bad blood between us that I'm embarrassed in many ways of my country, and also embarrassed by the way that Turks react to this. And so if there's any way of finding a successful way out, then I would hope that the Turkish government would take the first step by preparing its own citizens to do the right thing, which is to basically say, look, the U.S. Congress is not the right place to discuss the Armenian issue. And I hope that on the American side, the U.S. leadership takes a role of saying the same thing. The U.S. Congress can say whatever it wants, but we will remain a very strong ally of Turkey, and that we don't need to, rechange our entire relationship every time the congressional resolution comes up.
Joshua, this brought us to the end of our discussion. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure being here.
Today we had Dr. Joshua Walker, an American expert working on Turkey. This is Shakirdin Shahin. That was the point of view. Thank you for watching us. Stay tuned on 6 News.